friends. Welcome back to the Joyful House. My name is Cynthia with Cynthia's Joyful Creations. And it is time for Once Upon a Storybook as we continue reading Anne of Avonlea. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 8, Marilla Adopts Twins, and Chapter 9, A Question of Color. Mrs. Rachel Lynde was sitting at her kitchen window knitting a quilt just as she had been sitting one evening several years previously when Matthew Cuthbert had driven down over the hill with what Miss Rachel called his imported orphan. But that had been in springtime, and this was late autumn, and all the woods were leafless and the fields sere and brown. The sun was just setting with a great deal of purple and golden pomp behind the dark woods west of Avonlea, when a buggy drawn by a comfortable brown nag came down the hill. Miss Rachel peered at it eagerly. "There's Marilla getting home from the funeral," she said to her husband, who was lying on the kitchen lounge. Thomas Lynde lay more on the lounge nowadays than he had been used to do. But Miss Rachel, who was so sharp at noticing anything beyond her own household, had not as yet noticed this. "And she's got the twins with her. Yes, there's Davy leaning over the dashboard, grabbing at the pony's tail, and Marilla jerking him back. Dora sitting up on the seat as prim as you please. She always looks as if she'd been starched and ironed. Well, poor Marilla is going to have her hands full this winter, and no mistake. Still, I don't see that she could do anything less than take them under the circumstances, and she'll have Anne to help her. Anne's tickled to death over the whole business, and she has a real knacky way with children, I must say. Dear me, it doesn't seem a day since poor Matthew brought Anne herself home, and everybody laughed at the idea of Marilla bringing up a child. And now she has adopted twins. You're never safe from being surprised till you're dead." The fat pony jogged over the bridge in Lynn's Hollow and along the Green Gables lane. Marilla's face was rather grim. It was 10 miles from East Grafton, and Davy Keefe seemed to be possessed with a passion for perpetual motion. It was beyond Marilla's power to make him sit still, and she had been in an agony the whole way lest he fell over the back of the wagon and break his neck or tumble over the dashboard under the pony's heels. In despair, she finally threatened to whip him soundly when she got him home. Whereupon Davy climbed into her lap, regardless of the reins, flung his chubby arms around her neck, and gave her a bear-like hug. "I don't believe you mean it," he said, smacking her wrinkled cheek affectionately. "You don't look like a lady who'd whip a little boy just 'cause he couldn't keep still. Didn't you find it awful hard to keep still when you was only as old as me?" "No, I always kept still when I was told," said Marilla, trying to speak sternly, albeit she felt her heart waxing soft within her under Davy's impulsive caresses. "Well, I suppose that was 'cause you was a girl," said Davy, squirming back to his place after another hug. "You was a girl once, I suppose, though. It's awful funny to think of it. Dora can sit still, but there ain't much fun in it, I don't think. Seems to me it must be slow to be a girl. Here, Dora, let me liven you up a bit." Davy's method of livening up was to grasp Dora's curls in his fingers and give them a tug. Dora shrieked and then cried. "How can you be such a naughty boy, and your poor mother just laid in her grave this very day?" demanded Marilla despairingly. "But she was glad to die," said Davy confidently. "I know, 'cause she told me so. She was awful tired of being sick. We'd a long talk the night before she died. She told me you was going to take me and Dora for the winter, and I was to be a good boy. I am going to be good, but can't you be good running around just as well as be sitting still? And she said I was always to be kind to Dora and stand up for her, and I'm going to." "Do you call pulling her hair being kind to her?" "Well, I ain't going to let nobody else pull it," said Davy, doubling up his fist and frowning. "They'd just better try it. I didn't hurt her much. She just cried 'cause she's a girl." "I'm glad I'm a boy, but I'm sorry I'm a twin. When Jimmy Sprout's sister contradicts him. He just says, I'm older'n you, so of course I know better, and that settles her. But I can't tell Dora that, and she just goes on thinking different from me. You might let me drive the gee-gee for a spell, since I'm a man. Altogether, Marilla was a thankful woman when she drove into her own yard, where the wind of the autumn night was dancing with the brown leaves. Anne was at the gate to meet them and lift the twins out. Dora submitted calmly to be kissed, but Davy responded to Anne's welcome with one of his hearty hugs and the cheerful announcement, I'm Mr. Davy Keith. At the supper table, Dora behaved like a little lady, but Davy's manners left much to be desired. I'm so hungry I ain't got time to eat politely, he said with Marilla reproved him. Dora ain't half as hungry as I am. Look at all the exercise I took on the road here. That cake's awful nice and plummy. We haven't had any cake at home for ever and ever so long, 'cause Mother was too sick to make it, and Mrs. Sprott said it was as much as she could do to bake our bread for us. And Miss Wiggins never put in any plums in her cakes. Catcher, can I have another piece? Marilla would have refused, but Anne cut a generous second slice. However, she reminded Davy that he ought to say thank you for it. Davy merely grinned at her and took a huge bite. When he had finished the slice, he said, If you'll give me another piece, I'll say thank you for it. No, you've had plenty of cake, said Marilla in a tone which Anne knew, and Davy was to learn to be final. Davy winked at Anne and then, leaning over the table, snatched Dora's first piece of cake from which she had just taken one dainty little bite. Out of her very fingers, and opening his mouth to the fullest extent, crammed the whole slice in. Dora's lips trembled and Marilla was speechless with horror. Anne promptly explained with her best schoolma'am air. Oh, Davy, gentlemen don't do things like that. I know they don't, said Davy, as soon as he could speak, but I ain't a gentleplum. But don't you want to be, said shocked Anne. Course I do, but you can't be a gentleplum till you grow up. Oh, indeed you can, Anne hastened to say, thinking she saw a chance to sow good seed betimes. You can begin to be a gentleman when you are a little boy, and gentlemen never snatch things from ladies, or forget to say thank you, or pull anybody's hair. They don't have much fun, that's a fact, said Davy frankly. I guess I'll wait till I'm grown up to be one. Marilla, with a resigned air, had cut another piece of cake for Dora. She did not feel able to cope with Davy just then. It had been a hard day for her, what with the funeral and the long drive. At that moment she looked forward to the future with a pessimism that would have done credit to Eliza Andrews herself. The twins were not notably alike, although both were fair. Dora had long, sleek curls that never got out of order. Davy had a crop of fuzzy little yellow ringlets all over his round head. Dora's hazel eyes were gentle and mild. Davy's were as roguish and dancing as an elf's. Dora's nose was straight. Davy's was a positive snub. Dora had a prunes and prisms mouth. Davy's was all smiles, and besides, he had a dimple in one cheek and none in the other, which gave him a dear, comical, lopsided look when he laughed. Mirth and mischief lurked in every corner of his little face. They'd better go to bed, said Marilla, who thought it was the easiest way to dispose of them. Dora will sleep with me, and you can put Davy in the west gable. You're not afraid to sleep alone, are you, Davy? No, but I ain't going to bed for ever so long yet, said Davy comfortably. Oh, yes, you are. That was all the much tried, Marilla said, but something in her tone squelched even Davy. He trotted obediently upstairs with Anne. When I'm grown up, the very first thing I'm going to do is stay up all night just to see what it would be like, he told her confidently. In after years, Marilla never thought of that first week of the twins' sojourn at Green Gables without a shiver. Not that it really was so much worse than the weeks that followed it, but it seemed so by reason of its novelty. There was seldom a waking minute of any day when Davy was not in mischief or devising it. But his first notable exploit occurred 2 days after his arrival on Sunday morning. A fine, warm day, as hazy and mild as September. Anne dressed him for church while Marilla attended to Dora. Davy at first objected strongly to having his face washed. Marilla washed it yesterday, and Miss Wiggins scoured me with hard soap the day of the funeral. That's enough for 1 week. I don't see the good of being so awful clean. It's a lot more comfortable being dirty." "Paul Irving washes his face every day of his own accord," said Anne astutely. Davy had been an inmate of Green Gables for a little over 48 hours, but he had already worshipped Anne and hated Paul Irving, whom he had heard Anne praising enthusiastically the day after his arrival. If Paul Irving washed his face every day, that settled it. He, Davy Keith, would do it too if it killed him. The same consideration induced him to submit meekly to the other details of his toilet, and he was really a handsome little lad when all was done. Anne felt an almost maternal pride in him as she led him into the old Cuthbert pew. Davy behaved quite well at first, being occupied in casting covert glances at all the small boys within view and wondering which was Paul Irving. The first 2 hymns and the scripture reading passed off uneventfully. Mr. Allen was praying when the sensation came. Loretta White was sitting in front of Davy, her head slightly bent and her fair hair hanging in 2 long braids between which a tempting expanse of white neck showed, encased in a loose lace frill. Loretta was a fat, placid-looking child of 8 who had conducted herself irreproachably in church from the very first day her mother carried her there, an infant of 6 months. Davy thrust his hand into his pocket and produced a caterpillar, a furry, squirming caterpillar. Marilla saw and clutched at him, but she was too late. Davy dropped the caterpillar down Loretta's neck. Right into the middle of Mr. Allen's prayer burst a series of piercing shrieks. The minister stopped appalled and opened his eyes. Every head in the congregation flew up. Loretta White was dancing up and down in her pew, clutching frantically at the back of her dress. "Ow, Mama, ow, take it off, ow, get it out, ow. That bad boy put it down my neck, ow, Mama, it's going to go further down, ow, 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 ow." Miss White rose and with a set face carried the hysterical, wreathing Loretta out of church. Her shrieks died away in the distance and Mr. Allen proceeded with the service. But everybody felt that it was a failure that day. For the first time in her life, Marilla took no notice of the text, and Anne sat with scarlet cheeks of mortification. When they got home, Marilla put Davy to bed and made him stay there for the rest of the day. She would not give him any dinner, but allowed him a plain tea of bread and milk. Anne carried it to him and sat sorrowfully by him while he ate it with an unrepentant relish. But Anne's mournful eyes troubled him. "I suppose," he said reflectively, "that Paul Irving wouldn't have dropped a caterpillar down a girl's neck in church, would he?" "Indeed he wouldn't," said Anne sadly. "Well, I'm kind of sorry I did it then," conceded Davy. "But it was such a jolly big caterpillar. I picked him up on the church steps just as we went in. It seemed a pity to waste him. And say, wasn't it fun to hear that girl yell?" Tuesday afternoon, the Aid Society met at Green Gables. Anne hurried home from school, for she knew that Marilla would need all the assistance she could give. Dora, neat and proper, in her nicely starched white dress and black sash, was sitting with the members of the Aid in the parlor, speaking demurely when spoken to, keeping silent when not, and in every way comporting herself as a model child. Davy, blissfully dirty, was making mud pies in the barnyard. "I told him he might," said Marilla wearily. "I thought it would keep him out of worse mischief. He can only get dirty at that. We'll have our teas over before we call him to his. Dora can have hers with us, but I would never dare to let Davy sit at the table with all the aides here." When Anne went to call the aides to tea, she found that Dora was not in the parlor. Mrs. Jasper Bell said Davy had come to the front door and called her out. A hasty consultation with Marilla in the pantry resulted in a decision to let both children have their teas together later on. Tea was half over when the dining room was invaded by a forlorn figure. Marilla and Anne stared in dismay. The aides in amazement. Could that be Dora? That sobbing nondescript in a drenched, dripping dress and hair from the water was streaming on Marilla's new coin spot rug. "Dora, what has happened to you?" cried Anne with a guilty glance at Miss Jasper Bell, whose family was said to be the only one in the world in which accidents never occurred. "Davy made me walk the pig pen fence," wailed Dora. "I didn't want to, but he called me a fraidy cat. And I fell off into the pig pen and my dress got all dirty and the pig run right over me. My dress was just awful, but Davy said if I stand under the pump, he'd wash it clean. And I did, and he pumped water all over me. But my dress ain't a bit cleaner, and my pretty sash and shoes is all spoiled." Anne did the honors of the table alone for the rest of the meal while Marilla went upstairs and redressed Dora in her old clothes. Davy was caught and sent to bed without any supper. Anne went to his room at twilight and talked to him seriously, a method in which she had great faith, not altogether unjustified by results. She told him she felt very badly over his conduct. "I feel sorry now myself," admitted Davy, "but the trouble is I never feel sorry for doing things till after I did them. Dora wouldn't help me make pies because she was afraid of messing her clothes, and that made me hopping mad. I suppose Paul Irvin wouldn't have made his sister walk a pig pen fence if he knew she'd fall in." "No, he would never dream of such a thing. Paul is a perfect little gentleman." Davy screwed his eyes tight shut and seemed to meditate on this for a time. Then he crawled up and put his arms around Anne's neck, snuggling his flushed little face down on her shoulder. "Anne, don't you like me a little bit, even if I ain't a good boy like Paul?" "Indeed I do," said Anne sincerely. Somehow it was impossible to help liking Davy. "But I'd like you better still if you weren't so naughty." I did something else today," went on Davy in a muffled voice. "I'm sorry now, but I'm awful scared to tell you. You won't be very cross, will you? And you won't tell Marilla, will you?" "I don't know, Davy. Perhaps I ought to tell her. But I think I can promise you I won't if you promise me that you'll never do it again, whatever it is." "No, I never will. Anyhow, it's not likely I'd find any more of them this year. I found this one on the cellar steps." "Davy, what is it you've done?" "I put a toad in Marilla's bed. You can go and take it out if you like, but say, Anne, wouldn't it be fun to leave it there?" "Davy Keith!" Anne sprang from Davy's clinging arms and flew across the hall to Marilla's room. The bed was slightly rumpled. She threw back the blankets in nervous haste, and there in very truth was a toad, blinking at her from under a pillow. "How can I carry that awful thing out?" moaned Anne with a shudder. The fire shovel suggested itself to her, and she crept down to get it while Marilla was busy in the pantry. Anne had her own troubles carrying that toad downstairs, for it hopped off the shovel 3 times, and once she thought she had lost it in the hall. When she finally deposited it in the cherry orchard, she drew a long breath of relief. If Marilla knew, she'd never feel safe getting into bed again in her life. I'm so glad that little sinner repented in time. There's Diana signaling me to come to her window. I'm glad. I really feel the need of some diversion. For what with Anthony Pye in school and Davy Keith at home, my nerves have had all about they can endure for one day. Chapter 9, A Question of Color. That old nuisance of a Rachel Lynde was here again today, pestering me for a subscription towards buying a carpet for the vestry room, said Mr. Harrison wrathfully. I detest that woman more than anybody I know. She can put a whole sermon text, comment, and application into 6 words and throw it at you like a brick. Anne, who was perched on the edge of the veranda enjoying the charm of a mild west wind, blowing across a newly plowed field on a gray November twilight and piping a quaint little melody among the twisted firs below the garden, turned her dreamy face over her shoulder. "The trouble is, you and Miss Lynde don't understand one another," she explained. "That is always what is wrong when people don't like each other. I didn't like Miss Lynde at first either, but as soon as I came to understand her, I learned to. Miss Lynde may be an acquired taste with some folks, but I didn't keep on eating bananas because I was told I'd learn to like them if I did," growled Mr. Harrison. And as for understanding her, I understand that she is a confirmed busybody, and I told her so." "Oh, that must have hurt her feelings very much," said Anne reproachfully. "How could you say such a thing? I said some dreadful things to Miss Lynn long ago, but it was when I had lost my temper. I couldn't say them deliberately." "It was the truth, and I believe in telling the truth to everybody." "But you don't tell the whole truth," objected Anne. "You only tell the disagreeable part of the truth. Now, you've told me a dozen times that my hair was red, but you've never once told me that I had a nice nose." "I dare say you know it without any telling," chuckled Mr. Harrison. "I know I have red hair too, although it's much darker than it used to be. So there's no need of telling me that either." Well, I'll try and not mention it again since you're so sensitive. You must excuse me, Anne. I've got a habit of being outspoken, and folks mustn't mind it." "But they can't help minding it, and I don't think it's any help that it's your habit. What would you think of a person who went about sticking pins and needles into people and saying, 'Excuse me, you mustn't mind it, it's just a habit I got'? You'd think he was crazy, wouldn't you? And as for Miss Lynn being a busybody, perhaps she is. But did you tell her she had a very kind heart and always helped the poor, and never said a word when Timothy Cotton stole a crock of butter out of her dairy and told his wife he bought it from her? Mrs. Cotton cast it up to her the next time they met that it tasted of turnips, and Miss Lynn said she was sorry it had turned out so poorly." "I suppose she has some good qualities," conceded Mr. Harrison grudgingly. "Most folks have. I have some myself. You might never suspect it, but anyhow, I ain't going to give anything to that carpet. Folks are everlasting begging for money here, it seems to me. How's your project of painting the hall coming on?" "Splendidly. We had a meeting of the AVIS last Friday night and found that we had a plenty of money subscribed to paint the hall and shingle the roof too. Most people gave very liberally, Mr. Harrison." Anne was a sweet-souled lass, but she could instill some venom into innocent italics when occasions required. "Well, what color are you going to have it?" "We've decided on a very pretty green. The roof will be dark red, of course. Mr. Roger Pye is going to get the paint in town today." "Who's got the job?" "Mr. Joshua Pye of Cromarty. He has nearly finished the shingling. We have to give him the contract for every one of the Pyes, and there are 4 families, you know, said they wouldn't give a cent unless Joshua got it. They had subscribed $12 between them, and we thought that was too much to lose, although some people think we shouldn't have given it to the Pyes. Mrs. Lynn says they try to run everything. The main question is will this Joshua do his work well? If he does, I don't see that it matters whether his name is Pye or Pudding. He has the reputation of being a good workman, though they say he's a very peculiar man. He hardly ever talks." "He's peculiar enough all right then," said Mr. Harrison dryly, "or at least folks here will call him so. I never was so much of a talker till I came to Avonlea, and then I'd begin in self-defense on Miss Lynn, and then I had to begin in self-defense, or Miss Lynn would have said I was dumb and started a subscription to have me taught sign language." "You're not going yet, Anne?" "I must. I have some sewing to do for Dora this evening. Besides, Davy is probably breaking Marilla's heart with some new mischief by this time. This morning the first thing he said was, 'Where does the dart go, Anne? I want to know.' I told him it went around to the other side of the world, but after breakfast he declared it didn't, that it went down the well. Marilla says she caught him hanging over the well box 4 times today, trying to reach down to the dart." "He's a limb," declared Mr. Harrison. "He came over here yesterday and pulled 6 feathers out of Ginger's tail before I could get in from the barn. The poor bird has been moping ever since. Those children must be a sight of trouble to you folks." "Everything that's worth having is some trouble," said Anne, secretly resolving to forgive Davy's next offense, whatever it might be, since he had avenged her on Ginger. Mr. Roger Pye brought the hall paint home that night, and Mr. Joshua Pye, a surely taciturn man, began painting the next day. He was not disturbed in his task. The hall was situated on what was called the lower road. In late autumn, this road was always muddy and wet, and people going to Cromarty traveled by the longer upper road. The hall was so closely surrounded by fir woods that it was invisible unless you were near it. Mr. Joshua Pye painted away in the solitude and independence that were so dear to his unsociable heart. Friday afternoon, he finished his job and went home to Cromarty. Soon after his departure, Miss Rachel Lynde drove by, having braved the mud of the lower road out of curiosity to see what the hall looked like in the new coat of paint. When she rounded the spruce curve, she saw. The sight affected Miss Lynde oddly. She dropped the reins, held up her hands, and said, "Gracious Providence!" She stared as if she could not believe her eyes. Then she laughed almost hysterically. "There must be some mistake. There must. I know those Pyes would make a mess of things." Miss Lynde drove home, meeting several people on the road and stopping to tell them about the hall. The news flew like wildfire. Gilbert Blythe, poring over a textbook at home, heard it from his father's hired boy at sunset and rushed breathlessly to Green Gables, joined on the way by Fred Wright. They found Diana Barry, Jane Andrews, and Anne Shirley, despair personified, at the yard gate of Green Gables under the big leafless willows. "It isn't true, surely, Anne," exclaimed Gilbert. "It is true," answered Anne, looking like the muse of tragedy. "Mrs. Lynde called on her way from Cromarty to tell me." "Oh, it is simply dreadful. What is the use of trying to improve anything?" "What is dreadful?" asked Oliver Sloane, arriving at this moment with a bandbox he had brought from town for Marilla. "Haven't you heard?" said Jane wrathfully. "Well, it's simply this. Joshua Pye has gone and painted the hall blue instead of green. A deep, brilliant blue, the shade they use for painting carts and wheelbarrows. And Miss Lynde says it is the most hideous color for a building, especially when combined with a red roof, that she ever saw or imagined. You could simply have knocked me down with a feather when I heard it. It's heartbreaking after all the trouble we've had." "How on earth could a mistake have happened?" wailed Diana. The blame of this unmerciful disaster was eventually narrowed down to the Pyes. The improvers had decided to use Morton Harris's paints, and the Morton Harris paint cans were numbered according to a color card. A purchaser chose his shade on the card and ordered by the accompanying number. Number 147 was the shade of green desired, and when Mr. Roger Pye sent word to the improvers by his son, John Andrews, that he was going to town and would get their paint for them, the improvers told John Andrew to tell his father to get 147. John Andrew always averred that he did so, but Roger Pye as stanchly declared that John Andrew told him 157, and there the matter stands to this day. That night there was blank dismay in every Avonlea house with an improver where an improver lived. The gloom at Green Gables was so intense that it quenched even Davy. Anne wept and would not be comforted. "I must cry, even if I'm almost 17, Marilla," she sobbed. "It's so mortifying, and it sounds the death knell of our society. We'll simply be laughed out of existence." In life, as in dreams, however, things often go by contraries. The Avonlea people did not laugh. They were too angry. Their money had gone to paint the hall, and consequently they felt themselves bitterly aggrieved by the mistake. Public indignation centered on the Pyes. Roger Pye and John Andrew had bungled the matter between them, and as for Joshua Pye, he must be a born fool not to suspect there was something wrong when he opened the cans and saw the color of the paint. Joshua Pye, when thus animadverted upon, retorted that the Avonlea taste in colors was no business of his. Whatever his private opinion of it might be, he had been hired to paint the hall, not to talk about it, and he meant to have his money for it. The improvers paid him his money in bitterness of spirit, after consulting Mr. Peter Sloane, who was a magistrate. "You'll have to pay it," Peter told him. "You can't hold him responsible for the mistake, since he claims he was never told what the color was supposed to be, but just given the cans and told to go ahead. But it's a burning shame, and that hall certainly does look awful." The luckless improvers expected that Avonlea would be more prejudiced than ever against them, but instead public sympathy veered around in their favor. People thought the eager, enthusiastic little band who had worked so hard for their object had been badly used. Miss Lynn told them to keep on and show the pies that there really were people in the world who could do things without a muddle of them. Mr. Major Spencer sent them a word that he would clean out all the stumps along the road front of his farm and seed it down with grass at his own expense. And Miss Hiram Sloane called at the school one day and beckoned Anne mysteriously out into the porch to tell her that if the Society wanted to make a geranium bed at the crossroads in the spring, they needn't be afraid of her cow, for she would see that the marauding animal was kept within safe bounds. Even Mr. Harrison chuckled, if he chuckled at all in private, and was all sympathy outwardly. Never mind, Anne. Most paint fades uglier every year, but that blue is as ugly as it can be to begin with, so it's bound to fade prettier. And the roof is shingled and painted all right. Folks will be able to sit in the hall after this without being leaked on. You've accomplished so much anyhow. But Avonlea's Blue Hall will be a byword in all the neighboring settlements from this time out, said Anne bitterly. And it must be confessed that it was. Well, thank you for joining me for our storybook adventure today. I hope you enjoyed these chapters, and I look forward to seeing you next week as we continue reading Anne of Avonlea. Well, until next time, my friends, be joyful, stay crafty in your own way, make your own joyful creations, and above everything else, remember this: you are made of matter, therefore you matter. So go be your own exclamation. Mwah. Nugs and JOY. Bye.